I hadn't seen my Aunt Margaret or Uncle Nolan in over 7 years. The invitation came in an ivory envelope, thick and expensive, with my name handwritten in black ink. No last name, just Delia, as if I were still part of the family. Inside, a note in my aunt's unmistakable cursive invited me and my daughter to spend a long weekend aboard their yacht. For the sea air, she wrote, and for closure. It was the word closure that caught me off guard. Not reunion, not vacation. Closure. As if something had already ended without my knowing. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. People change. Maybe they really did want to make things right after all the silence and strain. And maybe, just maybe, they wanted to meet Annabelle. My daughter, my entire world. She had never met them, never asked why we didn't visit. At 6, she was still too young to question gaps in the family tree. We boarded the yacht on a Friday afternoon. The sky was a cold blue, cloudless and stiff with wind. Uncle Nolan greeted us with a tight-lipped smile and a leather-gloved handshake. He had aged but not softened. Aunt Margaret was warmer, in the way wealthy women are when they want to be liked. Performative, polished, and generous with compliments that don't mean anything. My cousin Bryce, now in his 20s, barely looked at me. He was taller, broader, with his father's stiff jaw and his mother's condescension. Still, I smiled. I smiled for Annabelle, who was already bouncing along the deck rails with her little hands outstretched like airplane wings. I told myself we'd stay 2 nights, maybe 3. I'd keep my distance, be polite, and we'd leave with stories of dolphins and sunsets, nothing more. The first night, things were quiet. Too quiet. No alcohol flowed. No laughter rang out. Bryce kept disappearing below deck with a duffel bag he never let anyone near. At dinner, he barely spoke, except to tell Annabelle not to feed the gulls. Aunt Margaret kept asking questions I didn't want to answer, about where I'd been, who I was seeing, what happened to Annabelle's father. I deflected, I smiled. The storm came the second night. We'd all seen it in the forecast. "Just a squall," Uncle Nolan had said. "We'll steer around it." But we didn't. By dusk, the water had turned black, and the wind began to howl. That's when Margaret suggested I take Annabelle below deck, for her safety. I hesitated, but Bryce was already opening the hatch. There was a lock on the inside of the door. I remember noticing that. Once inside, I tried to calm Annabelle by reading to her. The swaying of the boat was intense, almost theatrical. Then I heard it. Voices. Above us. Not yelling, discussing, calmly, like they were waiting. Then Bryce's voice. "The storm will take care of them." I froze. My throat closed. I reached for the door. Locked. No way to get it open from our side. Annabelle was asleep, curled in a blanket. She didn't hear. Thank God she didn't hear. I moved fast. I searched for anything heavy, anything sharp. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a storm anymore. The first thing I did was feel the edges of the room. It was instinct, like an animal testing the cage. I didn't want to wake Annabelle, not yet. She was still breathing softly, unaware of the shift in air around us. That was something no child should feel, the moment their mother transforms from calm to cornered. There were no tools, no weapon, just a set of emergency rations, life jackets, and an old wooden crate filled with soggy towels. I tried the door again, softly, still locked. I sat back against the wall and stared at the low ceiling, every muscle in my body humming with disbelief. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't paranoia. I heard Bryce. I heard his voice. "The storm will take care of them." And no one corrected him. No one argued. They were letting the storm do what they didn't have the nerve to finish. I slid over to the tiny porthole window. It was rain-slick and clouded from salt, but I could make out the wild sway of black water and flashes of distant lightning. The yacht was moving faster than before, cutting through the swells with purpose, not hesitation. That wasn't storm avoidance. That was control. That was direction. I didn't know how much time we had before the waves got worse, and I didn't know if they'd come down again. To check. To rescue us. To make sure we hadn't somehow survived what they hoped would kill us. I needed a plan. Fast. I crawled over to Annabelle and touched her cheek gently. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "we're going to play a special game. You have to be very quiet, okay? Like a mouse. A very brave mouse." Her eyes fluttered open. She nodded, not even questioning. God, she trusted me. I couldn't afford to fail her now. I grabbed a fire extinguisher, bolted beside the life jackets, and yanked hard until the screws gave way. I pointed at the small window. "When I say go," I told her, "you crawl through, hold on tight, and when I follow, we'll float. Okay? We're going to float together." She nodded again. The yacht jolted, a sharp shift that threw both of us against the wall. Annabelle whimpered. I steadied her and ran my palm over her damp curls. I took one deep breath. Then I struck. The porthole window didn't shatter on the first hit. It cracked. Spiderwebs of glass bled outward. I hit again. This time, the glass caved in, and seawater sprayed through, biting cold. Annabelle shrieked and clung to me. "Shh," I whispered, grabbing a towel and wrapping it over the jagged edge. "Now, baby! Now!" She crawled through first, slowly, trembling. I pushed her legs gently, guiding her body through the opening until she was dangling outside. Then I followed, one arm gripping the window frame, the other clutching her wrist. We dropped. The ocean swallowed us both. It was a miracle we weren't pulled under completely. The yacht surged past us, unaware or unconcerned. We kicked, paddled, until we reached a bobbing lifebuoy that must have broken free in the chaos. I held onto it with one arm, the other wrapped around Annabelle's chest. I don't know how long we drifted. Long enough to feel the storm in our bones. Long enough to hear the voice of something mechanical. A horn? A boat? The blinding white spotlight hit us like a slap. The Coast Guard. They pulled us aboard, drenched and shivering. A man wrapped Annabelle in a silver blanket and asked what happened. Before I could speak, another officer whispered something in his ear. His expression changed. And then he said words I'll never forget. "We need you to stay quiet about this. Please, for now." They gave us towels, blankets, and lukewarm tea in paper cups. I held Annabelle close, the silver foil wrapped around her like armor, though nothing could stop the way she trembled. Not from the cold anymore, from something she couldn't name. Children know when something's wrong. They just don't always know what shape it takes. The boat's interior smelled like damp wool and engine grease. A young officer named Wyatt, no more than 22, knelt beside me and said the captain was coordinating next steps. I asked what that meant. He didn't meet my eyes. Annabelle finally drifted into a shallow sleep against my chest, and I sat frozen, feeling her breath rise and fall. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the truth out of every uniform in sight. But I waited. That's what a mother does. Waits until it's safe to explode. After maybe an hour, the captain came down. His name was Avery. Tall, clean-shaven, eyes sharp but not cruel. He didn't sit, just stood in front of me like a quiet storm. "I need to ask what happened," he said. "I was nearly murdered," I replied, "by my own family. You want details, I'll give you details." He nodded once. "And you're sure it wasn't a misunderstanding?" I nearly laughed. "They locked us in, during a storm. My cousin said we wouldn't survive it. What part sounds unclear to you?" Avery glanced at Wyatt, then back at me. "This yacht. It's registered to a family trust. Margaret and Nolan Taylor?" "That's right." There's a sealed investigation on them from years ago, he said softly. It's not public, and most of it's redacted. All I know is it involves offshore transfers, a charity that doesn't exist anymore, and an incident in Bermuda no one wants to talk about. And you're telling me this why? Because I believe you, he said. But I also know what happens when people with money and lawyers get scared. There it was. The real reason behind the polite silence. They'll bury this, I whispered. They'll try. I looked down at my daughter. And if I don't stay quiet? Avery's face tightened. Then you better be ready for what they do next, and not just to you. We docked just before sunrise, in a remote harbor far from where we started. I thought someone would be waiting. Police, reporters, someone. But there was no one. Just an unmarked black SUV idling near the pier. You're being transferred to a temporary holding site for debriefing, Wyatt said, avoiding eye contact. They're moving us. Without even... Avery stepped in. You're not under arrest, but you're not safe either. You said your family tried to kill you. That makes you the key witness in something none of us fully understand yet. The SUV doors opened. I climbed in with Annabelle, every cell in my body screaming that this was wrong. But what other choice did I have? I wasn't just fighting to be heard now. I was fighting to stay visible. As we pulled away, I looked back toward the water. The yacht was gone, as if it had never been there. And I knew they'd come back for us. They always do. The holding site was not what I expected. We arrived just past dawn. A faded metal gate creaked open to reveal a low, gray building that looked like it had once been part of a decommissioned military base. The air was thick with salt and the sour tang of old oil. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. There were no windows, just long corridors, outdated vending machines, and the quiet hum of surveillance cameras that followed us like ghosts. Annabelle clung to me, her hand wrapped tight around my thumb. She hadn't spoken since we left the boat, but I could feel her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. They gave us a cot and thin blankets in a room they called family quarters. The walls were bare. I counted 7 ceiling tiles between the 2 flickering light bulbs. An hour passed. Then another. No one came. Finally, the door opened and a man stepped in. Not Captain Avery. This one wore a civilian suit and had the kind of haircut that screamed federal. His badge said C. Dunham. His smile was polite, practiced, but it never reached his eyes. Miss Carlyle, he said, pulling up a chair. May I? I nodded once. I want to assure you, first and foremost, that you and your daughter are safe now. Safe. The word felt like ash in my mouth. Your family is currently unavailable for comment, he added. The yacht returned to port empty. There are no formal complaints on file, and they've retained legal counsel, aggressively. So they're already spinning this, I said. They're very practiced at it, he replied calmly. That's why we need your full account. Every detail I gave it to him, every last word. I told him about the invitation, the icy smiles, the carefully curated hospitality, and the moment the door locked behind me. I even described the sound of Bryce's voice above me, so casual, so damning. When I finished, Dunham tapped his pen twice against the folder in front of him and asked, "Why do you think they did it?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know, not yet. Instead, I asked him something. What happened in Bermuda? That wiped the smoothness off his face. Excuse me? I know there was an investigation, sealed. Captain Avery told me, offshore transfers, a fake charity, something you buried. He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. You have no idea what you're stepping into. I do, I said. That's why I brought my daughter below deck when they told me to. I knew something was wrong, and now I know it's bigger than just them. Dunham stood. You'll be contacted again soon. And then he left. That night, after Annabelle finally fell asleep on the cot beside me, I sat awake, listening. I heard a phone ring down the hall. I heard voices, and I heard my name. I wasn't supposed to survive. That much was clear. But now that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The next morning, I woke up before Annabelle and paced the length of our windowless room. The floor was cold even through my socks. The camera in the corner blinked its slow red eye, reminding me that I was never really alone in here. There had been no updates, no access to a phone, no attorney. I hadn't even seen the sun in almost 2 days. But what unsettled me most wasn't the silence. It was how familiar this kind of silence felt. Manufactured, like the kind you learn to survive in a toxic marriage or a crooked courtroom. The kind where people look you in the eye and tell you nothing's wrong, because everything is. I didn't know how long we had, and I didn't know how long I could stay passive without becoming complicit in whatever this was. So I started watching. There was a cleaning woman who came twice a day. Small gray ponytail, not unfriendly. She didn't speak, but she made a point of knocking and waiting. I timed her visit, 7 minutes and 30 seconds. I also noted that Dunham never entered our room again, not once since the first interrogation. But every time I asked to speak with Captain Avery, I was told he was not available. Annabelle was beginning to ask questions too. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" she whispered once, her voice hushed like we were in church. I wrapped my arms around her and didn't answer. I didn't want to lie, but I also couldn't give her a truth I didn't fully understand myself. That night, I made a decision. If no one was going to help us, I'd help myself. I waited until the hallway quieted. Midnight, maybe later. Then I slipped into the narrow corridor outside our door. I'd wedged a plastic spoon from dinner between the lock and frame hours earlier, just in case. It gave easily. I moved fast but careful, keeping my head down. The security office was 2 halls away. I'd memorized the floor plan from the evacuation chart on our wall. The door was ajar. Inside, a young man, barely older than a college intern, sat watching a bank of monitors. He had headphones on. I stepped in slowly, quietly, and stood behind him long enough to read one of the screens over his shoulder. There were satellite feeds, live ones, and there, dead center, was an overhead image of the marina where my aunt's yacht had docked. Marked, watched. They were still tracking Margaret and Nolan. I reached for a file on the nearby desk. It wasn't locked. Inside, a printed log of all visitors to the holding site. Most were blank or redacted, but one name wasn't. Clay Benedict. My chest tightened. Clay was the lawyer who handled my parents' estate years ago, before Margaret took control of most of the assets. He had gone silent when I asked about missing funds. I'd tried reaching him 3 times after my father's death. Nothing. And now he had visited this place. Last week. The guard turned slightly, and I stepped back fast, ducking into the hall. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would betray me. But he didn't notice. I slipped back into the room and locked the door behind me. I sat beside Annabelle, shaking. This wasn't just a family betrayal. This was a network, a legacy, maybe even a cleanup job gone wrong. They weren't trying to silence me because of what I saw. They were doing it because of what I might know. By the time the hallway lights dimmed and the guard rotation changed, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait for another interview, another excuse. I was going to send a message, one that couldn't be deleted or intercepted. It started with a paper napkin. I had saved one from lunch and flattened it smooth against the back of a children's book. Then, in my tightest handwriting, I wrote out everything. The yacht, the storm, Bryce's voice, the escape, the file with Clay Benedict's name, the locked room, the camera blinking red. I didn't sign it. I folded the napkin into quarters and tucked it inside Annabelle's sketchbook, which the guards allowed her to carry. I'd seen the same young woman escort us to the common area each morning, a facility nurse, not a guard. She had kind eyes. Not soft, but not hard either. And she always bent down to Annabelle's height when speaking to her. That would be my window. The next morning, while Annabelle played with her crayons, I leaned in close and whispered, "Draw something bright. Then give your sketchbook to Nurse Elaine." She nodded like it was a game. When Elaine returned for morning check-in, Annabelle handed her the book with a shy smile. "I drew you a flower." Elaine thanked her and tucked it under her arm without opening it. That was enough. I had done what I could. Now came the waiting. Hours passed. Lunch was delivered, cleared. The door stayed shut. No alarms, no change in the guard. And then, an hour after dinner, a quiet knock. Not a guard's knock. I opened the door slowly, heart thudding. Elaine stood there, face pale, lips thin. She held the sketchbook in one hand, but she didn't return it. "I read it," she whispered, "and I believe you." I didn't know whether to cry or collapse. "There are things I can't say here," she continued, "but you're not the only one they're watching. And your aunt and uncle, they're not just rich, they're connected, generations deep." "Why are they trying to kill me?" I asked. Her answer chilled me. "Because you're the last uncontested heir, and you weren't supposed to be alive." I stared at her, stunned. "I don't want their money. They're not counting on that. They're counting on you disappearing." I closed the door behind her as quickly and silently as I could. My hands trembled as I turned to Annabelle, who was already watching me with wide eyes. I pulled her into my arms and whispered the only thing I could think to say. "We're not staying another night." I didn't sleep that night. Elaine's words wouldn't stop echoing through my head. You weren't supposed to be alive. They had let me live long enough to keep appearances intact, long enough to arrange an accident that wouldn't leave questions behind. But now I had proof, or at least enough to set something in motion. The napkin note, Elaine's help, the file with Benedict's name, all breadcrumbs leading toward the truth. I just had to make it out. Elaine came the next morning, her face unreadable under fluorescent light. Her uniform was crisp, her posture a little too rehearsed. I nodded slightly, a signal. She blinked once, slowly. That was her reply. That afternoon, during Annabelle's scheduled playtime in the facility's small garden space, Elaine approached with a medical kit and a clipboard. "Standard vitals check," she said, loud enough for the nearby camera to catch. She gestured for us to follow her back inside. Instead of the medical wing, she guided us down a back hallway, unlit, windowless. She tapped a code into a keypad, and a hidden door opened to what looked like a service corridor. 10 minutes, she whispered. "There's a maintenance truck parked outside the west fence. The driver's name is Luke. He owes me. Get in. Don't stop. Don't speak. Drive east." "Elaine!" "Don't waste it," she said sharply. Then softer. "I've seen what happens when people stay." She handed me a bundle of clothes and a key fob. I didn't ask where she got them. Annabelle clung to me silently. She knew. Children know when silence becomes a shield. We slipped out the door and ran. Not fast, not wildly, but with controlled urgency. My heart pounded, every shadow screaming danger. I could almost hear Bryce's voice on the yacht again, mocking, certain. "The storm will take care of them." But it hadn't. And now I had something worse than a storm on my side. Purpose. The truck was there, white, nondescript, engine idling. "Luke?" I asked, barely above a whisper. The man behind the wheel nodded once and opened the back door. "Don't talk! Get in, now!" We obeyed. The ride was rough, the shocks worn down to steel. I held Annabelle close as we bounced along unfamiliar roads, trying not to count the seconds. After what felt like forever, the truck slowed. Luke didn't speak, just handed me a manila envelope with my name scribbled across the front. Inside, a prepaid phone, a list of 3 names, and a note. Find Clay Benedict. He knows where the money is buried, and who helped cover it. I stared at the name. The man who had handled my family's estate. The man who had disappeared after my parents' death. The man whose signature was on every will, except the last one I was never allowed to see. "Where are we?" I asked finally. Luke looked at me through the mirror. "Safe for tonight. No more than that." I nodded. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I was done being hunted. And I was done being quiet. We didn't rest long. One night. That's all we were allowed. Luke disappeared before sunrise, leaving behind only tire tracks in the gravel and a motel room key I hadn't asked for. I stood at the window as the sky softened from charcoal to blue, watching Annabelle breathe deeply under a secondhand quilt. Then I turned to the envelope again. 3 names, one circled in red, Clay Benedict. I didn't recognize the others. No addresses, just phone numbers, maybe aliases, maybe dead ends. But Clay? That name was carved into every document I had ever seen as a child. He was there when my parents drafted their final will. He was there when Nolan and Margaret stepped in to help, a phrase I now recognized for what it was. A takeover. I called the number with shaking fingers. It rang once, then twice, then a click. "I was told you'd call," a voice rasped. I didn't speak at first. "I don't know who to trust," I said. "Then it's time you learn," he replied. "There's more than money. There are names, dates, and if you don't come quietly, they'll take your daughter next." The line went dead. I looked at Annabelle. Her hair curled around her cheek like ivy. She looked peaceful, but peace was no longer an option. I wrote down the address that flashed on my phone just before the call dropped. A warehouse, outside Charleston, midday. Whatever Clay Benedict had to show me, it would either set us free or bury us deeper. The warehouse was tucked between 2 derelict piers, its windows clouded with years of salt and neglect. I parked the car Luke left for me under the shade of a leaning pine and told Annabelle to stay buckled. "Lock the doors. Don't open them unless it's me." She nodded with more courage than I felt. Inside, the air was thick with motor oil and mildew. A single light buzzed from a dangling wire in the rafters. And there he was, Clay Benedict, older, thinner, but unmistakable. His hair was more silver than white, his suit wrinkled but deliberate. He held a battered file in his hands, like a priest clutching a sacred text. "I kept it all," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Everything they paid me to forget." "What is it?" I asked. "Proof," he said, tapping the file. "Your parents' final revision to their will, names of offshore accounts, and documents showing your aunt and uncle diverted estate funds before your father was even buried." I stared at the pages he laid out. My mother's signature, my father's handwriting, dates, transfers. One file was labeled simply, "Delia, to be removed." A noise outside broke the silence. Clay didn't flinch. "They'll come?" he said. "They always do when the truth's too close." I turned toward the door, my hand already reaching for the file. I didn't know how far this would go, only that it couldn't stop here. Not now, not after everything. I didn't sleep that night. The file from Clay lay across the motel bedspread like a loaded weapon. I stared at the signatures, the offshore transactions, the clause that named me the sole heir once my father passed. It wasn't just money they stole. They erased me from my own bloodline. I wasn't meant to inherit anything. I was meant to vanish. Annabelle stirred beside me, her tiny hand wrapped around the stuffed rabbit we rescued from the facility. She didn't know the full story, only that Mommy was fighting something big, and that monsters didn't always hide under beds. They wore suits and smiled at dinner. I left Clay's file on the table at sunrise. Alongside it, I placed a flash drive with scanned copies. Then I walked into the local sheriff's office and asked to speak to someone who wasn't on anyone's payroll. It took hours. Background checks, raised eyebrows. Eventually, a young officer named Moeller listened. Really listened. By evening, the FBI had the file. By the next morning, headlines began trickling in. Quiet at first. Words like fraud, inheritance crime, and estate conspiracy danced across the bottom of news screens. It would grow. I knew it would. We moved again, quietly. No press, no names. Just me and Annabelle, in a small town where nobody knew what we had been through. She asked me once, a few weeks later, why we had to leave the boat. I knelt beside her. Because we weren't supposed to survive, I said gently. But we did. And that's our story now. Not how they tried to erase us, but how we wouldn't let them.